Elements of a short story. There are 6 main elements of every short story. In fact, any story. Theme, setting, characters, point of view, characterization, and plot. The setting of a story is the time and place where the story is set. Very simple, very straightforward. The 5 elements of any setting are time, place, the imagery used to establish the setting, and description. There are always 2 types of description. Direct description is where the author states it outright. Now it was cold and wet. Tolkien, 31. Indirect description is when the author uses actions, thoughts, or dialogue, and the reader has to infer what's going on. His hood was dripping into his eyes. His cloak was full of water. Tolkien, 31. In the direct description, Tolkien states, it is cold, it is wet. In the indirect description, from the same exact page, we are left to infer that it is cold and wet. The character is wearing a hood. It is dripping into his eyes. His cloak is full of water. Strategies used to create imagery and description are often the poetic elements that we covered earlier. To establish the plot of any story, whether it is a short story, a novel, a movie, a television show, anything at all, we follow the basic plot diagram. It starts with exposition. Exposition is the once upon a time. It establishes where we are in the story, how the story begins. It establishes the baseline where our problem starts to rise. The initial incident, it happens at the very end of the exposition, and that is the first important event that causes conflict. From that initial incident, we have rising action, things that lead to the climax or turning point of our story. The climax of the plot is the point of crisis. It is the point of highest interest, often described as the decision or action from which there is no turning back. We can't turn back on this now. You can't unmake this choice. It's just going. Once we hit that turning point, we have falling action. These are the consequences of that turning point that lead to the resolution. How does the plot, how does that conflict finally end itself? That leads to the conclusion. It's that tying up of loose ends, that happily ever after. The conflict of any story, short story, movie, novel, play, anything at all, is the struggle between forces in that story. Now, it can be an external conflict, challenges involving outside forces against a character or against people. It can be an internal conflict, challenges involving the inner turmoil of that character or the inner turmoil of society. It's something internal. You can't necessarily see it. Now, as we go through, we're going to talk about 4 main types of conflict. The first is man versus man. This one's easy. We have 2 sets of people who are fighting in conflict with each other. Man versus man. This is an external type of conflict. Then we have man versus society. This can be a very external conflict where we have man fighting against an unjust society, or it could be internal where the man is fighting for his place in society and has to come to terms with something on the inside. Then there's man versus nature. We see this in a lot of different short stories, plays, movies, where man is fighting against nature itself. And then there's man versus himself. This is a completely internal conflict. You are dealing with something on the inside, and very rarely do we see it on the outside. The point of view of a story is how the story is told, from whose eyes. Now, there are three main types of points of view. First person point of view is one person telling the story. You are only seeing the story from that character's point of view. You do not get any other thoughts or ideas or feelings from anyone else. It's all how that one narrator is perceiving it. Second person point of view is when the narrator refers to just one character. Okay, this is very common in songs, but we have a character following one person. Third person limited point of view, again, follows one character, but starts to open up the fictional world. Third person omniscient is where the narrator knows everything, and the narrator tells you everything. This is the type of story where you might jump around on a page where first you find out what one character is doing, and then it says, but secretly across town, and you find out what someone else is doing. There's also different types of narrator. An innocent eye is a narrator who's innocent, naive, like a child. We also see this, there are certain novels that are told from somebody who has a mental disability, and they look at the world very differently. And it's kind of beautiful in that they're trying to get the audience to see a different version of the world. There's also stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is literally the narrator's perspective written as thoughts, just going. It may not make sense completely. It may just go on and on and on and on and on. You may have to go back several pages to figure out what just happened. Stream of consciousness is like you put all of your thoughts on a page and you really don't care if it makes sense. Now, the characters in a short story, a novel, a movie, whatever, are actually described using something called characterization, the description of the personalities of those characters. And again, much like with setting, there is direct and indirect characterization. In direct characterization, the author tells you what those characters' traits are. This is the good guy. This is the bad guy. This guy was quite honest. In indirect characterization, the character is revealed through actions, thoughts, and dialogue. You are left to decide whether Severus Snape is actually a good guy, or whether he was just a bad guy who had randomly good bits of his personality. An argument my friend and I are still having. Now, when it comes to characters, there are two main types of characters within any story. There's the protagonist. The protagonist is the character the reader identifies with. We usually call this person the good guy. It's the one we're almost rooting for to win. The antagonist is the character or force. This is important. Sometimes the antagonist is not a person. It's the character or force working against the protagonist, usually the bad guy. So for instance, if we were in a man versus society type of story, the protagonist might in fact be the man that we're rooting for. But the antagonist may not actually be a person. It is society itself, the rules of society this man is fighting against. Here we have two examples of some famous movie protagonists. We have William Wallace, and we have Maximus Decimus Meridius from The Gladiator. Here we have their antagonists. We have Longshanks, Edward I Longshanks, and we have Emperor Commodus. Now, when we're talking about characters, there are four types of characters we will always run into. Round characters are well developed. They demonstrate varied, contradictory traits. We see them as real people. Flat characters really don't stand out. They're just there, they're placeholders. Dynamic characters change during the course of the story. We see them grow as characters. Static characters, on the other hand, stay the same throughout. They are at the beginning as they are at the end. There is no change, there is no growth. Here are some famous characters. Theme is the most difficult part of your story. And we find this is the most difficult because oftentimes people want to call it the lesson. It is the lesson or the moral of the story, and that's not really what a theme is. The theme is your larger idea, not the moral, not the lesson. Those come into play, but it's the larger idea. For instance, the theme in the Lorax is about caring for your environment. Okay? It's about caring about what you're doing. It's about caring. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Now, the moral of the Lorax is to take responsibility for your action or inaction, or that choices have consequences, good or bad. But when we look at the theme, that overarching theme is not the same. The theme is trying to tell you something bigger. Now, what I'd like you to do is look back through this particular presentation and open up the short story practice that goes with it. You may have to open up Internet Movie Database, which you will find on a link down below, to help you out. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to watch the trailer for Fast 5. Yes, I know it's a little dated. However, it's one of my favorite Fast and Furious movies. I'd like you to watch this trailer and, using Internet Movie Database as you might need, answer those questions. Now, for the most part, there are no right and wrong answers. We're really looking for you to practice breaking down a story using a movie trailer, because we know movie trailers are the basic parts of a short story, the basic parts of a story put into one bit so that you, the watcher, want to watch the movie. So I'm asking you to break this down. Again, I just want you to give it a shot.